up on Dialogue Weekend. The World Bank warns coronavirus could push 150 million people into extreme poverty by the end of 2021. How can this economic tragedy be avoided? US House lawmakers condemn the 4 tech giants, saying they've become monopolies who've abused their power and urging their breakup. Is this the end for the Big 4? And this week's newsmaker, now on Dialogue Weekend.
Welcome to Dialogue Weekend. I'm Xu Jindu. Extreme poverty is set to climb for the first time in more than 2 decades as the COVID-19 pandemic pushes millions of people to the brink. A recent World Bank report shows that by the close of 2020, more than 9% of the world will be living on less than $1.9 per day. Before the pandemic, that figure was expected to drop to 7.9%. So what's going on? Can the rise be reversed as quickly as it happened? To talk more about poverty reduction and the world economy in the post-COVID era, we are joined by Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, and via Skype we have Isabel Hilton, CEO of China Dialogue. So welcome to the show, both of you. I start with you, Isabel. We are talking about up to 150 million people will fall back to below the extreme poverty line. So extreme poverty, people live on $1.90 a day. So what life is like for people living in extreme poverty, and what part of the world they are in now?
Well, at those levels, we're really still looking at mostly rural workers, people who live on very low levels of farming, or people who've been pushed off the land and are migrants. We're looking largely at Africa, parts of Latin America, a little bit of Asia, but the middle income economies have pockets of poverty as well, but they don't tend to go quite as low as that. So these are more larger global systemic issues where you find extreme poverty.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, the goal is for the World Bank, like World Poverty Reduction 2030. That is to keep the people, or the percentage of the population for this globe living in extreme poverty to 3%, below 3%. But obviously, it's getting harder to achieve that goal. Right. So because of the pandemic, because of the ensuing economic recession. So in what way this pandemic and also the economic impact somehow block people from rising further or being lifted out of poverty?
Well, this is actually a historic pattern in my opinion. After every natural disaster, prolonged pandemic like this over 1 year looks like it's going, always the recovery is of something, what Vice President Biden was referring to, the K-shaped recovery. And if you look at experience in 1918, 1919, that's the Spanish flu. The recovery was always also like that. There's basically 2 patterns, a distribution effect going on. There's the growth pattern, the recovery pattern for the more advanced economies, the developed world versus the developing world. And there's also this dichotomy between sort of more well-off people in these economies and the poor people in these poor countries. And this is really heartbreaking in my opinion. But I think it's very little the government can do, because right now most governments are sort of fiscally constrained. The tax revenues are being eroded right now. Everyone is fighting for themselves. They're trying to open up the economy, and the well-being, the welfare of the poorest people in the society is probably the least thought about right now, on the minds of these politicians. So it's a very difficult time, and then of course, as policymakers, we need to think about these people, right, and try to help them. But I think the policy instruments, the policy space is really constrained at this point. It's a very tough situation right now.
Okay, Isabel, if you look at this special period of time, 2015 to 2017, 2 or 3 years, that period, according to the World Bank report, so the rate to get people out of poverty actually decreased, like a 0.5% every year, compared to previously from 1990 to the 2015. So it's like every year you have like a 1% increase of reduction of poverty. So what happened during that time?
Well, I think this is largely a measure of success in Asia and in particular in China. I mean, what gave those very encouraging figures over that time period was China's very rapid growth. Now, that obviously had a big effect on poverty reduction in China. You got people moved off the land into jobs in the cities, into the wage economy, and you had, you know, all those 2 decades of very rapid and very substantial growth. Now, there comes a point in any economy where that pattern begins to slow, where you've pretty much built your infrastructure, where you're sucking in much less in terms of raw materials, your wage levels have begun to rise, and the economy begins a transition towards slower growth and a more sustainable model, and China's trying to make that transition right now, as we know. So one effect of that is that absolute poverty reduction as a rate slows, but there are fewer poor people in China already.
Right.
So, you know, it's not necessarily a bad thing. There is a knock-on effect of the slowing and the changing nature of the Chinese economy, which is that China's suppliers, and particularly commodity suppliers, have suffered quite a lot of volatility, and China is no longer that kind of big engine of growth in that sense that it was, for instance, after the financial crisis. But I don't think we should see the slowing down of growth pre-COVID, of poverty reduction pre-COVID as necessarily a negative sign. I think it's going to be quite different now, because as the professor says, we are looking at very sustained economic impacts, and you know, we've all seen such enormous disruption to normal economic activity across the world as a result of the pandemic. A lot of that just won't come back. There will be entire sectors that won't come back, and I think people are looking at, you know, what will life be like after COVID? How will people's habits have changed? How will economies have changed? And what should we be planning for now to mitigate some of the worst impacts on the most vulnerable people? And one thing that I think people are very much aware of, certainly in the circles that we move in, is a green recovery, because there is the other background impact, which the World Bank also refers to, which is climate change. And again, the poorer countries are going to have really quite devastating impacts from climate change to their economies, and more people pushed into poverty by climate change. So if we can take advantage of this moment and say, we are going to have to plan, we are going to have to change things, let's change things in a sustainable way, let's go back to those sustainable development goals and really use them as the foundation of future growth. And then I think at least something positive might come out of this rather terrible situation.
The World Bank Group leader, David Malpass, mentioned that if we want to reverse this trend, you know, we need a different economy. So Isabella, explain to us, you know, what does he refer to as different economies here?
I think that, again, you're looking at a kind of more sustainable measures. I mean, for a long time, we've rather been in love with GDP as a measure of economic well-being, which it isn't. It's a measure of a particularly limited aspect of economies, but it doesn't take account, for example, of the depletion of natural capital on which essentially all future prosperity is built. We need to be looking at things like all the things that will contribute to a climate transition. So energy efficiency, for example, insulation of houses, insulation of buildings, reduction of waste of all kinds. That also, you know, generates economic well-being. We need to be looking less at linear growth and more at circular economy. We need to be looking at, you know, what is going to work for the next generation, rather than how do we get a quick hit this year. That's the kind of transition that I think, you know, we ought to be looking at. And it is very difficult because, you know, as we know, the room for manoeuvre is very narrow. You know, the British government has spent unbelievable amounts of money just keeping people's heads above water right now. So there is going to be a feeling that if anything is going to be expensive, can we really afford to do it? But equally, there are those who argue we can't afford not to do it.
Right. On
we
the
need
other
a more
side, going back, John, I want to pick up on what you said about, on one hand, you have people suffering greatly from this pandemic, this global recession, but also the other end of the scale, you see, tech companies and also senior executives, they are making a lot of money.
Right. I think, looking back at the history, what has in the past contributed to the elimination of poverty or alleviation of poverty in the past has really been globalization in a lot of countries, right? I mean, this is the fundamental reason why countries get involved in global value chain production, and get manufacturing moving to these countries and create jobs and let people, make people migrate from sort of a agrarian lifestyle to industrial workers, and this transformation really lifts millions and millions of people out of poverty. And I think, one important thing you have to keep in mind is that this idea of deglobalization, going back to sort of a more domestically economy-oriented idea, is really going to hurt many people in the developing countries. We really need to keep a globalized world as it was in the past, as before the pandemic, not to be deterred by this. And I think this is a very key insight. Otherwise, we're going to see, again, not only the opportunity is lost for people migrating from agrarian lifestyle to industrial worker lifestyle, but also we're going to see people moving back, actually. That's a dangerous trend if we do that.
That's right. Speaking of course, the worry about the people basically falling back to poverty or extreme poverty is about, you mentioned about the Chinese efforts to reduce poverty. Of course, this is a very impressive one. 900 million people lifted out of poverty over the past more than 40 decades, 4 decades, over there. But China is also suffering from the COVID-19 and its impact. And the target is like this year, China is to eradicate extreme poverty inside this country. So is that target achievable?
Well, I think that one thing one can safely say in China is that if a target matters, if a target is identified with the party leadership, it will probably be achieved because great efforts will be put into achieving it. One question, though, is how it's achieved. And in the past, not all targets were achieved in ways that were particularly helpful. Sometimes, there is a temptation to game the system to achieve the target, and you might find that if you go back 5 years later, things haven't really been maintained as the target might suggest. So I think what will be a challenge for China is not so much meeting the target in a kind of headline way, but meeting the target in a way that will be sustained for the coming decades.
Sustainable way, yes. Well, let's shift a little bit to the monopoly issue in the United States. After a lengthy investigation, the U.S. House Antitrust Committee recently released a report accusing the country's 4 largest technology firms, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Google, of functioning as monopolies. The report called for sweeping changes to be made to the companies and for the reform of U.S. antitrust law. Can such tech giants be tamed, or should they be left alone? And what might this mean for the tech industry in general? To learn more, we are joined again by Professor John Gong and Isabel Hilton. So John, what prompted this investigation, which has lasted for 9 months, right? In the first place?
Well, this is a new phenomenon we are seeing in the digital economy. We are seeing these companies growing larger and larger, mostly due to what in economics we call the network externality effect. In other words, the competition between companies in a space like this is really cutting throat. I mean, it's not like there's equilibrium, there's market share division. No, it's not going to be like that. It's really either I survive or I totally destroy you, right? I mean, the companies get bigger and bigger and bigger. So now, we have this huge platforms as these companies been showing us, and they, becoming like the choke points. For a lot of companies, smaller companies, who are involved in this big ecosystem or value chain, whatever you call it. Okay, the fact that they have huge market power, or even we call it monopoly power. It is actually a technical term in antitrust economics called dominant position. It's called market dominance position, right? So even if they hold those positions, that by itself is actually not unlawful, at least according to China's anti-monopoly law, Article 17. I'm actually very familiar with this. Okay. Article 17 regarding the abuse of dominance, market dominance behaviors. Okay. So the position itself, the market power position itself, by itself is actually not even sinful in my opinion. Okay. It could happen through different reasons. It could happen through historical reasons, or maybe just by luck, right? Like Microsoft came to be, really by luck, I think. But the issue is, once you own that position, the kind of a behavior you engage in is whether they're anti-competitive or not. And I can give you a list of behaviors that are deemed unlawful according to China's Article 17 anti-monopoly law. For example, tying, bundling, right? Refuse to deal. Exclusive deal. You have to deal with me. You can't deal with JD.com, for example. Right. You can only deal with my, Alibaba.
It's kind of abusing their position.
Right. So these kind of behaviors are outlawed by regulation. So it's really an issue of whether, first of all, they hold these positions. I think they do, in my opinion, without really getting into detailed analysis of the data. But just by common sense, I think they pretty very large market shares, right? No matter how you actually define what's called relevant market position. So the issue is whether these behaviors have they really engaged in these kind of behaviors? Are these behaviors anti-competitive? Because there are also other mitigating factors to sort of justify those behaviors. Maybe because of technological reason, because of innovation, right? So it's really a case-by-case analysis. So my position is that, look, these companies have grown so big that definitely they deserve an investigation. By the Justice Department according to the U.S. law, or by the Federal Trade Commission. But whether they violate law or not, it has to be litigated, in my opinion. I'm pretty sure these companies will go to the court to defend themselves. So we have to see whether this is going to be a real issue or not. Right.
Well, Isabel, if you take a look at these four big companies, obviously they are in a dominant position or in monopoly position. Like Facebook in social networking, right? Google and Amazon, etc. So, how big a concern is that? I know they mentioned about that in the report, like for example, killer acquisition. How bad that will be to competition, say?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right to be concerned, and actually, although the tech companies are new, the practices aren't new. And if you look back in American history at the history of the anti-monopoly struggle, which is kind of goes on, it's gone on for more than 100 years. So and usually these monopolies were generated by whatever the technology of the day was. So, the oil barons, the railway barons, the kind of in that industrial age, you had these giant companies, which, again, they seemed too big to take on, but in fact the government did in the end, take them on and broke them up. Because the point is that they become very powerful very quickly, then they constrain both the freedom of action of government, but they begin to act, as we've heard, in their own interest at the expense of the public interest, and that's really where things get very difficult. But I think in terms of the general health of the economy, one of the things that these giant monopolies do is that they stifle competition from below, and in any economy, and I'm sure China's no exception, that the job creation and the innovation don't come from these huge monopoly businesses anymore. They may have done when they started, but now there are new challengers, and they get killed off by giant tech monopolies. So there are lots of reasons, really, both to do with abuse of a privileged position, but also to do with the wider health of the economy and the future of innovation, that it's a bad thing to allow them to go on like this.
That's right. Well, John, of course, we're looking at what will happen next after the report, right? Whether those companies will be broken up and whether there will be, say, lawmaking about this antitrust, basically anti-competition law over there. Former CEO of Microsoft, Steve Ballmer, was quoted as saying recently, "I'll bet money big tech won't be broken up." What's your point?
Well, Microsoft was in this position for a long, long time. There was many discussions.
Was he speaking
lawsuits.
based on his experience?
I think he is, absolutely. He is speaking about his own experience with Microsoft. But I do have a strong opinion about this broke-up idea. Okay, this was tried before in the United States. In 1911, Standard Oil was broken up into several smaller oil companies, right? I believe it's in 1982, if I remember this correctly. There's this consent decree from Judge Green regarding the breaking up of AT&T into AT&T long distance business and the 7 what's called Bell operating companies, ARBOCs. I was actually working for one of the research of the consortium owned by these ARBOCs. Yeah. So I remember this history very well. But looking back, this hasn't been a success story in my opinion. Look at oil companies; they're merging back again, right? Today's AT&T, it started from a small AT&T, started from Southwestern Bell, later on it's called SBC, and then it merges with other companies. Making into another AT&T,
coming back.
Bigger AT&T. Yeah, they're coming back. Today in the United States, in the wireline business, only 2 companies, Verizon and AT&T, right? So, so this whole idea about breaking up the company, I'm not sure this is basically called a structural remedy. Whether this is effective in solving a problem. I mean, if I'm right, trying to address the behavioral issues. I mean, these conducts, right, under the assumption of
like law enforcement.
Right, the conducts under the assumption of a dominant position. You don't have to really deprive the company of that dominant position. You can only outlaw. You can only forbid these companies, right, from engaging in this kind of a behavior. So, so my personal opinion is to be very careful about really sort of government interference in terms of picking up the company, right? Okay. There are other remedies that we can try.
Seems like you don't need to be worried, because the
no, I am worried. Actually, I am worried. I think
what I mean is like this report. Obviously, it was produced mostly by Democrats-led, staff.
Some people think it's
right
partisan,
there.
right?
And also, there's a partisan feature to this report.
That's right.
It's about Republicans are not exactly happy with the conclusion because they say some of the top-notch issue, for example, the concern about moderating power by Facebook or Twitter, constraining the platform for conservatives are not addressed in that report. So, what's your take on that? What kind of outcome will come out of this report?
Well, my take on that, I'm afraid, is just we're in an election year and in a highly polarized political moment, and almost anything the Democrats say would be immediately condemned by the Republicans, even if they said, the earth is round. I think we would, have Republicans saying, no, that's just a plot, it's all flat. Yeah. So I wouldn't take that too seriously. What will, determine the fate of this is what happens on November the 3rd, and who in the end controls the Senate and who is president after the election. That's going to be a big issue. I mean, just going back to the question of what to do about these monopolies, I agree that breaking up, they do tend to reform, and that is why this has to, this issue is never definitively solved. But there are other tools in the toolbox. For example, there are mechanisms for reviewing mergers and acquisitions, and if they look like they're going to create an undesirable monopoly, they can be banned. So it's a lot of this is a matter of political will, and I think that the anxiety is that you need to do it before these companies get too big to take down, because if they're too big, then they begin to influence in a very negative way what laws can be passed and what action can be taken. So the struggle gets harder the longer you leave it. So, yeah, well, it doesn't ever go away.
We will see after this November election. Let's leave it there for now and take a look at this week's Newsmaker. So it's about the first time Nobel Prize chemistry, in this sense, was given to a duo, two women scientists. That's very encouraging. And tell us about their research. How significant is that?
Oh, it's hugely significant. In fact, it was quite a short-lived partnership. They worked together for 2 years. After meeting at a conference, discovered that they had shared interests, and although they weren't even on the same continent, they managed to collaborate so effectively that at the end of 2 years they had developed a technique for gene editing in living genes, which absolutely revolutionizes everything from medical science to agricultural potential. It's just massive, and it will go on being extremely important. It will be the foundation of continuing developments in all those sectors. So it is very important. And actually, I think the speed with which they were given the Nobel Prize is a recognition of the fact that this is transformative stuff.
Yes, very soon actually after their research, the outcome. John, if you look at the history, 120 years, the Nobel Prize has only been awarded to 57 women out of more than 900 recipients.
Yeah.
In medicine, physics, and chemistry, women laureates are far lower than average. So what is the reason?
Well, I think it's not surprising that in the scientific community that I know of, usually there are more men than women. I mean, that's a fact. Maybe other in my school, in my economics school, we have heck of a few very good productive women professors. My office mate is incredible lady, good researcher. But I think it's just a fact that we have to admit that there are more men than women in the scientific field. But when there are those women who are really into the research, they're incredibly good. At least the women that I've come across. So I think. We can't introduce sort of quota system into the scientific community. I think that's not right. But I think the fact that the Nobel Committee really acknowledges the contribution of these two women is just extraordinary. I'm not an expert in that area, but I also want to add one point. The method they have discovered is really economical. I think that's the most important thing here. They have developed an economic method of a very cheap method, basically, of genomic editing that can be used in a wide range of applications. It lays the foundation for future applications in this area. It opens a wide range of new directions. So I think it's in that sense that that discovery is revolutionary. And I think they was every honor and prize for that matter.
Obviously, it's about, if you look at that, here we have two women scientists, receiving this prize here. It's very encouraging to young girls around the world,
Right.
And also I think one of the professors mentioned that there's a general lack of interest in science, which is worrying. But on one hand, encouraging. On the other hand, it's kind of worrying. So what do you think we need to do to encourage more young girls to involve in the science field? You have less than 1 minute, actually.
I think these women are fantastic role models, but I think that there are structural problems, that women's work has been under-recognized. Rosalind Franklin, for example, on in the double helix question, encouraging more women, and I think recognizing their work, more prizes. I think that would encourage women to say, yes, we can do this.
Well said. It's really about, I think every country, every government should pay more attention and work to improve, to create more opportunities and chances for the young girls to participate in this kind of work. Well, with that, we are coming to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app or on the YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. You can find me on Twitter, Xu Qinduo. Thank you for your time. See you next week.